two forms of sense perception are space and time. You see, geometry is dealing with space. It's the science of space. And if you've got a different conception of space in non-Euclidean geometry than you do in Euclidean, then his claim that there is a universal category, universal concept rather, of space, has got to be changed. So I think most people who follow the Kantian line tend to think less about a priori forms of sensibility, space and time, and to emphasize simply a priori categories of understanding. Get it? You see, so that the forms of space and time are perhaps learned. Subsequent neo-Kantian thought, because there was a neo-Kantian movement through the 19th century, revived in late 19th century, influential on into early 20th century, existentialism grew out of it. Later neo-Kantians see these categories as learned, culturally acquired, transmitted. Learned in the course of experience, changing with the course of experience. Max Weber, for instance, in the cultural side. Well, in that case, what you get is a relativizing of the structures of thought, you see. And that obviously makes it a lot harder to maintain that there is any objective truth in science. Because if the categories are culturally influenced, you have an even greater problem about identifying any objective points of reference coinciding with them. Yes. And so in that way, it's the neo-Kantian movement relativizing a priori grids that led to the cultural relativism, to the relativizing of the notion of truth, not just of knowledge, you see, and to various kinds of subjectivism in the 20th century, of which existentialism was one. Yeah. So keep that in mind. Which reminds me, I said last time I was going to start today by commenting on the influence of Kant, and I guess I forgot about that. All right, let me just briefly indicate, and we'll pick up on the threads later on. Kant's emphasis on human subjectivity and its creative resources that we bring to experience gives a new meaning to the term imagination. Watch Kant's use of it. We'll get into it, if not today, next time. Imagination. It provided the point of departure for Coleridge, the early Romanticists, speaking of imaginative expression, self-expression in the arts. Romanticism is a result of Kantian influence, with its emphasis on the creativity of our inner self, the creative resources of the inner self. And if in some kinds of psychology applied to the arts you hear notion of certain universal symbols, universal symbolism, certain kinds of depth psychology, that's the influence of Kant. You see. Depth psychology generally, Freudian, Jungian, indirectly the influence of Kant. Certain subjective influences shaping our behaviors and our thoughts. You see. German nationalism, people. Now get over the individualism of the 18th century into a more corporate sense of identity in the 19th century, and the inner spirit of that corporate identity has all of the Kantian creative power bursting out all over. And 19th century nationalism is indirectly the influence of Kant. Expression of romanticism at the national level. A romanticized view of nation. Manifest destiny and things of that sort. 19th century romanticism. German idealism, Hegel, such like. Yeah, ultimately, the real is of the nature of mind, creative thought. Where do they get that idea? Kant. Existentialism? Yes, we live in a world of bare, meaningless fact, and we have to create our own meanings and our own value, our own selves, in fact, according to Sartre. You know, you can't read Sartre without hearing faint echoes of Kant that would make him turn over in his grave. So forth. Or go on to the postmodern movement in our day. You see the emphasis on subjectivity that is coming up all over the place, so that you have no objective knowledge at all. The hermeneutical movement, the political correctness movement. You see, all of that is saying subjective influences, subjective influences. That began with Kant. Poor Kant, he never meant half of that. But the evil that men do lives after them. The good is oft interred with their bones. And I think that applies to Kant as well. Shakespeare spoke early but truly about Kant. David?
Kant's categories are universal, but in some sense, aren't they sort of objective rather than subjective?
Well, it depends what you mean by objective. The word objective, like the word subjective, has at least two different meanings. It may mean, as it does in Berkeley, subjective is what is in your mind. That's the way it is in Kant. It's in your mind. An objective is what is independent of any mind, of any knower, of any consciousness. Now, for Kant, these are subjective. They're not objective categories. But I call that metaphysical subjectivity, metaphysical objectivity. But the other sense of subjectivity and objectivity is more attitudinal. What sort of approach do you take? What is your stance as you look at something? You see, an objective stance is one that is detached, spectator, observer. You see, I'm being quite objective when I grade your examinations. At least I'm trying to be. Say all the nasty things you like about Kant and about me. I try to stand back and be objective. You see. On the other hand, a subjective stance is one that's involved, passionate. I care. You see. Now that is the Kierkegaardian sense of subjectivity. When Kierkegaard talks of a subjective path, he's talking of passion, being concerned. You see. You come to Christianity, you come to Christ by a subjective path, says Kierkegaard. He doesn't mean it's all subjective and relative. No, he means you can't come without the passion of faith, of love, of hope. You're not coming otherwise. Yeah. So, distinguish those two senses, the attitudinal and the metaphysical. Esther? Yes. Well, that's precisely what Kant is saying.
Right. So are those forms already there?
They're not in the external world. We've no way of knowing.
But are they internal?
Yes. Well, they are subjective in the sense that they are structures built into our perceiving and thinking. You see, they're already there in that sense. You don't have to develop a concept. They're already functional.
They're not innate, they're just there.
They're not innate in the sense of having an innate idea that you already know and think about independently of experience. No. You don't have clear and distinct innate ideas recollected under the force of Plato's dialectic. No. You don't have clear and distinct ideas that become self-evident upon reflection. No. You only become aware of these in operation. You see? So you don't get to them simply introspectively, with help of dialectic. You get to them by what? The transcendental method. The transcendental method. Remember last time? What is the transcendental method? Well, it's the method of getting at the transcendental ego, the transcendental self. What does he mean by transcendental? He does not mean transcendent, remember. He does not mean transcendent, though once in a while he gets the two words mixed up, at least the translations do. He means transcendental. That is to say, the creative, subjective contribution to experience. So how do we get at that? Well, the transcendental method, you see, is an attempt to bracket all of the empirical particulars and to ask, what's left? Did you get that? I'm not sure from your faces. Let me get the passage, and you can underscore it, because it's tremendously important to see that method becomes very influential. What you want is page 300 and let's see. Oops. Yeah, 372, first of all. The top of the first column. Even with our experiences, different kinds of knowledge are mixed up, which must have their origin a priori. For even if we remove from experience everything that belongs to the senses, that's the particulars, there remain nevertheless certain original concepts and certain judgments derived from them, which must have had their origin entirely a priori, independent of all experience. Okay? Now, hold that in your mind, and maybe with your finger, and look at 375. I call all, second column in the new paragraph, 375, I call all knowledge transcendental, which is occupied not so much with objects as with